U.S. military will begin enforcing a full-scale blockade of all maritime traffic into and out of Iran as Navy minesweepers clear a path to open the Strait of Hormuz after high-stakes peace talks end without a deal. Welcome to a brand new hour of America's Newsroom. I'm Dana Perino.
Morning to you. I'm Bill Hemmer. Here we go. This is the hour. The fate of the two-week ceasefire unclear as Iran refuses to give up on its nuclear program. The U.S. declaring a naval blockade against Iran after both sides walked away from the talks late on Saturday. The Strait of Hormuz is a key flashpoint as the president ramps up the pressure continuously on Tehran.
Their military.
Welcome. Let's be very clear about what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now. This is no longer just an Iran chokepoint story. It is now a two-sided energy squeeze. And that makes the global energy shock much worse, including for Canada. Here's why. On one side, Iran is coordinating or controlling passage from inside the Persian Gulf. On the other side, the United States is blockading service tankers, turning ships around and blocking access into the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. Reuters reported that in the first 24 hours of the U.S. blockade, 6 merchant ships turned back, and that oil had already surged by around 50% since the war began because of the risk to Hormuz shipping. That is not a normal disruption. That is a corridor being squeezed from both ends. And once that happens, the problem is no longer just, can oil physically get through? The problem becomes, who is allowed through? Who gets blocked? Who gets delayed? What does insurance cost now? What happens if rules change tomorrow? What happens if crews refuse the route? What happens if refiners can no longer trust the schedule? That is why the energy situation gets worse so fast. Because energy markets run on reliability, not just on raw supply. And once reliability breaks, prices rise before full shortages even happen. Reuters reported the following day that shipping constraints were still in place, refiners were scrambling for alternative crude, and Brent crude remained elevated in the mid-90s because the market still did not trust Hormuz to function normally. Now, let's talk about why this is especially dangerous. If Iran alone threatened Hormuz, markets would still hope for one diplomatic off-ramp. But when Iran controls one side of passage and the U.S. blockades the other side, the market is no longer dealing with one point of pressure. It is dealing with 2 political military filters inside the same choke point. That means tankers are being screened twice. Once by Iran's control over outbound passage. Again by U.S. enforcement on inbound or serviced tanker movement. That is far more disruptive than a one-sided closure story. And it spreads the shock far beyond Iran. Because Hormuz is not just an Iran route. It is a global oil route. A global LNG route, a refinery route, a shipping route, an inflation route. Reuters reported the European Union is already warning of a prolonged energy shock if the conflict continues, noting that about 20% of global oil and LNG normally pass through Hormuz and that severe disruption could force industrial strain and fuel stress. So once the corridor loses reliability, even non-Iranian Gulf flows get repriced. Saudi barrels, UAE shipments, Qatari LNG, Asian refining schedules, European energy planning. Everything gets more fragile. Now, here is where the Canada angle becomes very important. A lot of people hear higher oil prices and immediately assume Canada wins because Canada exports oil. That is only half the story. Yes, parts of Canada's oil and gas sector do benefit. Reuters reported that Canadian energy firms expect profits to surge because of the war-driven oil spike. But Reuters also reported those same firms are not rushing into major new investment because pipeline capacity is near its limits. Long-term constraints remain, and executives do not trust the shock to last. So Canada gets some producer upside. But the broader Canadian economy still gets squeezed. And that is the part people need to understand. Canada may export oil, but Canadians still pay for fuel. Canadian businesses still move goods by truck. Canadian farms still use diesel. Construction still depends on transport. Food still depends on logistics. Households still get hit at the pump. And Ottawa knows that. Reuters reported that Carney's government is temporarily suspending the federal fuel excise tax on gasoline and diesel from April 20th to September 7th, specifically to soften the blow from rising fuel costs. The move is expected to cut gasoline prices by about 10 cents per liter and diesel by about 4 cents. Reuters also noted that the government explicitly linked the measure to cost pressure on transportation, agriculture, food, housing, construction, and delivery. That tells you something very important. Canada is not behaving like a country enjoying an energy boom. Canada is behaving like a country trying to shield households and businesses from an imported energy shock. That is the real Canada angle. The oil sector gets partial upside. The broader economy gets cost pressure. And in tradeconomics terms, that means the blockade is not rescuing Canada. It is splitting Canada internally. Producers gain, but consumers, transport, food, housing, and inflation management all come under pressure. And then you get the next layer, the Bank of Canada problem. If the US blockade adds to Iran's control over passage and keeps oil high, then inflation risk stays alive for longer. Reuters reported the IMF now sees the adverse scenario with oil around $100 as increasingly plausible, and the severe scenario could put oil in the $110 to $125 range and push the world toward recession. Reuters also reported the IMF warning that the war is increasing broader financial stability risks by lifting inflation expectations and bond yields. That matters enormously for Canada. Because Canada is already dealing with softer growth, tariff pressure from the US, and an uneasy policy environment. So, if the Hormuz shock now keeps inflation sticky, then the Bank of Canada has less room to ease. That is the trap. Weak growth would normally argue for relief. But war-driven energy inflation makes that relief harder. So the US blockade added to Iran's own pressure does not just raise oil, it makes macroeconomic management harder in Canada. That is why this is worse than a simple price spike. Now, here is another important Canada point. Reuters reported that the loonie strengthened when diplomatic hopes improved and the US dollar weakened, even though oil fell sharply that same day. That tells you Canada is not getting a clean, higher oil equals stronger Canada story. The currency is moving with risk sentiment, diplomacy, and US dollar dynamics, not just with crude prices. So again, Canada does not get a simple win here. It gets some oil sector profit, but broader household pain, inflation pressure, more policy difficulty, and a currency story that is still tied to global fear and relief cycles. That is not a healthy energy position. That is vulnerability inside an apparent advantage. And now zoom out. What the US blockade is supposed to do is isolate Iran. But what it is also doing is exporting cost pressure into allied economies. Canada is one of those economies. So even if Washington says the blockade is targeted, the market does not experience it that way. The market experiences it as higher global risk, more expensive shipping, more expensive substitute crude, more expensive transport, and more inflationary pressure everywhere. That includes Canada. So here is the real tradeconomics take. Iran's control over passage was already destabilizing. The US blockade layered on top of it does not calm the system. It multiplies the friction. Because now Hormuz is no longer just a threatened choke point. It is a two-sided uncertainty machine. And for Canada, that means the situation gets worse in a very specific way. Not because Canada runs out of oil, but because the country still absorbs the wider cost shock through fuel, freight, food, inflation, and policy stress, while only part of the oil sector captures the upside. That is the paradox. Canada produces energy. but it still pays for energy disorder. And when the disorder is this severe, Iran controlling one side, the US blockading the other, the result is not just an oil price spike. It is a wider confidence shock to the energy system itself. And once that happens, everybody pays more, including Canada. So here's the closing question. Is the US blockade really isolating Iran? Or is it helping turn Hormuz into a global inflation machine? One that Canada's households, businesses, and central bank now have to absorb along with everyone else. This is Trad Economics. The AU in the next.